Well, thank you very much. So, what I want to do is continue the story I started to tell yesterday by talking about some of the sources of what seems to me a very important gulf between the scientific community and the general public. And I'm going to review a tiny little bit of what I said yesterday, just in case there are people here who today who were there yesterday, but it's pretty much self-contained what I say today. Now, if you read philosophers writing about science, and if you read journalists writing about science, and if you read quite a lot of people writing about science, they tend to hail science as a really terrific thing, say things like it's the greatest achievement of our species. We now know so much thanks to the combined efforts of all these people who stood on the shoulders of the giants who came before them and were giants themselves, etc., etc., etc. You're probably familiar with the rhetoric. But who are the we who know so much? Who actually benefits from the enormous amount of scientific knowledge that has been amassed? It seems to me that many people who think that science is oppressive and tyrannical and that it somehow should be more democratic start out, at least, from some sort of sense of exclusion. Okay, now, as I said yesterday, public knowledge, that is, the knowledge that we collectively possess, what is, if you like, in or on the books. Science is a central part of that. It's a very prestigious and reliable part. And its central function, the central function of public knowledge, seems to be that of helping people to advance their individual projects. I'm tempted very often when I think about public knowledge to think of it as though it was some huge library or central depository at which bits of good information have been placed. We hope they're good information. And then that is available to individuals who can then use that information in planning their lives, in fulfilling their aspirations, in pursuing their projects. Okay, now, yesterday what I talked about were two things. The way in which the knowledge is built up, that is the kinds of questions to which answers are sought, all that, the context of pursuit or the context of agenda setting, if you like, and the context of certification, the ways in which bits of knowledge are certified within the scientific community. What I now want to turn to is this idea of public access. Okay? If people do not have access to what is so supposedly public knowledge, they can easily fall into a condition of unfreedom. They don't know what it is that is really behind the difficulties they encounter. And here are actually rather dim versions of slides you saw more bright, pictures you saw more brightly yesterday, of people in conditions where they don't identify what it is that is interfering with their pursuit of their lives. Now, I'm really interested in these cases. And today I'm going to be talking about the problems that arise for individuals in taking advantage of knowledge that is in principle available to them. So think of results that have been correctly certified, relevant to many people's lives, that are stored in some public depository, and somehow something goes wrong in that individuals don't have access to that. And this can happen because of what I'm going to call a number of varieties of ignorance. So the ideal situation is that knowledge that is relevant to your projects individually or collectively is there, and you know that it's available, you know what sort of knowledge you need, and you have the ability to go and find it. You are in a condition at the moment before you get it directly remediable ignorance. You have enough background to find reliable sources and understand them. That's the ideal that stands behind the rhetoric that scientific knowledge is a common possession, it's a great thing for all of us. Well, actually, with respect to all sorts of areas, very few of us are in a condition of directly remediable ignorance because we simply don't know enough to actually understand the sources of the information. But Often we're better off than that. We're in a condition, we're not totally badly off. We have indirectly remediable ignorance. That means that we know where to go for authoritative sources that will tell us in language we can understand, right, what the answer to questions that we seek. The trouble with contemporary life, I think, is that quite a lot of people in democratic societies are neither in a position of directly remediable ignorance or indirectly remediable ignorance, but in something worse. They're in a condition of irremediable ignorance. The mildest grade of this is when you just don't know where to look. You don't know who the experts are. You don't know who to trust, but you aren't particularly skeptical. It's just the situation is confused and you don't know. You hear conflicting opinions, conflicting voices, and you're puzzled about whom you should believe. But that can be turned into something even more problematic, which I'll call resistance. You actually think that the people conventionally held in your society as experts, the people whose opinions the apparent sort of elite, the government, the people, those people trust, are actually not trustworthy, that they're driven by some sort of values or ideological considerations that are contrary to your own. I think quite a lot of people in various societies are in a condition of resistance on particular issues. Global warming, the status of evolution, in Europe particularly on genetically modified organisms, where they believe that many of the things that are supposed to be bits of scientific knowledge about the safety of these are in fact driven by profit motives. This relates to a question that I was asked last night, very good question at the end. And then finally, the worst state, which I don't think is absent in North America or in Europe, is a condition I'm going to call alienation, where you think that the whole thing is just thoroughly corrupted, that there's this massive across-the-board foisting of misinformation on the public and on policy because of some elite ideology that overrides the values and the wisdom of ordinary people. So, I mean, there's a kind of, these grades are somewhat arbitrary. You might ask me, you might probe these distinctions, but what I want you to get is kind of continuum. Ignorance at the top is not problematic at all, but by the time you get to the bottom, it's really quite problematic. Okay, so let's go on. Why are there forms of irremediable ignorance and resistance and alienation? Well, I'm going to talk about three interacting conditions. Predicaments in which information is needed for action before scientific consensus has been achieved. So the scientists have not yet reached agreement, and yet we need to do something. That's one factor. Scientific competition, that means competition within the research community, is a second factor. And biased transmission of information is a third factor. And I think that at the moment, this is my diagnosis of some of the predicaments that democratic societies face at the moment in the use of public knowledge in advancing democratic aims and individual values comes from the interaction of these three kinds of factors. Okay, now I'm going to consider these three sources in the context of some principles that are normally considered very central to democracy. And if you think about democracy, Democrats put a great deal of emphasis on the value of free speech and of dissent. And I'm going to suggest that those things are actually quite deeply problematic when technical issues are involved and a massive part of the population suffers from a condition of irremediable ignorance or of resistance or alienation. Okay? So I'm going to suggest that democracy and democratic thinking about these sorts of debates have to be much more subtle than it's often taken to be. So let's start off with a very familiar democratic principle, the idea of free and open discussion of issues. I think, and just to put boldly what I'm now going to try to argue for, that when technical issues are at stake, it's a dangerous myth to think that they should be subject to free and open discussion. So let me begin by giving you two authors, or actually three authors, whose writings I admire enormously, who have been the most articulate and eloquent spokesman for free and open discussion. Oh, no, what happened? So the first is Milton. Right? You know, philosophers don't normally go all the way back to Milton's Areopagitica, which is one of the early defenses of freedom of publication. But it's absolutely incredible, right? And though all the winds of doctrine were let loose to play upon the earth, so truth be in the field, we do injuriously by licensing and prohibiting to misdoubt her strength. Let her and falsehood grapple, whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter. He's really splendid, both, right? Mill is almost as good, actually. Actually, Mill and Harriet Taylor, since in my completely non-expert judgment, I'm inclined to take Mill's statement that he co-wrote or co-thought on liberty with Harriet Taylor very seriously. So here's Mill. The peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity as well as the existing nation, those who dissent from the opinion still more than those who hold it. If the opinion is right, they're deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what almost as great benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. These are terrific words, and you know, you just sort of put them up on the screen, you see, how could freedom of discussion be a bad thing? How could it be problematic? Well, there are two very, very important assumptions that Milton and Mill make. First, Milton makes this assumption. He talks about truth succeeding in a free and open encounter. He commits himself to an idea of evidential harmony, that when controversial issues discussed in public, the final assessments will be made by people who have the capacity to assess the evidential support of the rival positions. Okay? That's what I take free and open encounter really to mean. So if that's not the case, as I'm going to suggest in a little while, there are going to be problems. Mill, on the other hand, makes a different assumption. In the long chapter 2 of On Liberty, in which he discusses freedom of discussion, he claims tacitly the outcome of public discussion of a controversial topic will affect all people in the same way. He speaks of the promotion of freedom as if all the recipients, all the participants, all the spectators in the discussion were interchangeable. That need not be the case. It may be the case that a particular set of issues will bear on different people differently, and what actually promotes the freedom of some may actually interfere with and diminish the freedom of others. And it may be the case that the certain issues are discussed in a particular context may lessen the freedom of those who are already the least free in the society. And that's, it seems to me, a deep and important issue. Okay, now, so there are these two assumptions, and I don't think that in contemporary contexts they are usually, in fact, often valid. Now, you might say, in response to this, that whatever else is said, believing the truth is such a fundamental value that it cannot be overridden by anything else, and therefore we should look at the value of free discussion and debate solely in epistemic terms, and solely in terms of the production of true belief. But I think that would be a mistake. People who talk about Mill and Chapter 2 of On Liberty often forget that it is Chapter 2 of On Liberty. And in Chapter 1, Mill says very explicitly what kind of freedom he thinks is most fundamental. The only freedom that deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to attain it. The belief in truth in a society is not necessarily always going to be congruent with individuals not being interfered with as they seek to try to pursue their own good in their own way. And that is, it seems to me, a problem. So, if you accept the kind of picture of democracy that I offered yesterday, the ideals of freedom and equality in freedom, where freedom is, among other things, Mill's only freedom deserving of the name, the freedom to pursue one's own good in one's own way, it may well be the case that free and open discussion is actually not conducive to those ideals of freedom. Okay. Well, why not? Well, in part because of biased transmission. That was one of my factors in information. If the media through which information is transmitted to the public are biased in favor of inculcating certain ideas, then it is quite possible that that condition of evidential harmony will not be met. Well, it is often thought that market mechanisms will, as it were, keep media of transmission of information on track. The idea being that if you have media that do not report accurately, they will be found out and people will cease to trust them. But unfortunately, in the modern world, there are many reasons why media succeed. They entertain, they give information on topics that are interesting to the viewers, but not necessarily the topics about which the viewers need to know. Hearers, readers, internet users, whatever. I'll talk in terms of viewers because of this slide. And in some cases, the viewers may never be in any position to know whether or not the media in question have submitted an accurate bit of information or not. Worse, a very profitable strategy under certain kinds of market conditions, and here I'm going to wave my hands in the direction of an economic model that I won't try to present to you. Media can actually succeed by, as it were, dividing up the market into niches and as it were, giving the niche, each niche, what it wants to hear. And that is what I think is going on in a very large measure in the United States. I wonder whether CBC does better. It doesn't seem to me that modern BBC does much better, but then perhaps I have this nostalgic view for the auntie of my youth. Okay, so bias transmission is real and it undermines that principle of evidential harmony. But there's something worse that applies in the case of science, and these are points that were made long ago by Kuhn in The Structure of Scientific Revolution. Even if you do not believe the thesis often ascribed to Kuhn that scientific revolutions, complex scientific debates in science are irresoluble, the following points seem to me to be pretty uncontroversial. First, that considerations underlying many scientific disputes are subtle and delicate, that they take a long time to resolve, and that no single argument convinces everyone. These features of technical disputes, I think, militate against the idea of pitching a disputed scientific topic into the public arena and expecting that the condition of evidential harmony will be valid in that context. What moral should we draw from all of this? Well, I think that there is actually an ethical responsibility for people who think of themselves as pursuing free inquiries. Again, I'm going to quote Dewey. These persons represent a social division of labor, and their specialization can be trusted only when such persons are unobstructed cooperation with other social occupations, sensitive to others' problems, and transmitting results to them for wider application in action. That's from Dewey's Reconstruction in Philosophy. I think what Dewey has in mind is this, that the community of inquirers, prominently including the community of natural scientists, actually has a responsibility. And part of its responsibility is to make sure that information gets transmitted well. It is playing a role in society, and members of the group that play that role have responsibilities to ensure that they do not contribute to the spread of misinformation within the society, and that may mean holding back on certain forms of public dissent and it may mean holding back on certain forms of publication of opinion. Okay? Now that sounds a really awful thing for somebody who started out talking about democracy and its values to say, but it seems to me that there's a really serious and important point here. Now, let me be very explicit. The fact that scientists may have these kinds of ethical responsibilities, of which I'll be saying more a bit later on, doesn't necessarily mean we should have some sort of social practice of enforcing censorship. Sometimes you can think that somebody has a responsibility to do something, but you shouldn't take up mechanisms for punishing them, convicting them, or trying them if they don't fulfill that responsibility. Think about issues about human relationships. There might be all sorts of responsibilities that you might have in your relationships with other people, but we think it would be wrong, in fact perhaps quite seriously wrong, to have mechanisms that actually prohibit that and bring penalties for those who break them. Now, I'm going to leave open, I'm going to leave this question dangling, and I'm actually not going to ask it, about how far these scientific responsibilities go. I mean, do scientists actually have a responsibility when they are in the minority within their professional community not to voice their dissent in public? If they had such a responsibility and lived up to it, a lot of trouble would be avoided. But is that actually too much to ask? You might think that it isn't too much to ask because it's rather, their situation is rather analogous to those of many people in democratic societies who find themselves outvoted and find laws in place that they do not agree with and yet feel they have to abide by. Okay, now, it seems to me, to sum up this phase of the discussion, that Milton and Mill really do offer us a worthy ideal. There's no question about that. It'd be lovely to live in a world in which the conditions that make free and open discussion genuinely valuable were realized. But I think we have to get away from a mistake of translating this into public rhetoric about all sorts of things, including scientific discussions, consequential scientific discussions. We shouldn't reiterate that ideal as if there weren't serious questions about the arena in which this competition of ideas actually works. So it seems to me that we should actually see this not as something automatically to be translated, but rather to take the freedom of inquiry as an important ideal that we might struggle to achieve by putting in place conditions that might make it a value that can actually be realized, rather than something we just take for granted. Now I want to complicate things a little bit by introducing the third factor that I pointed to, namely the fact there is competition within the scientific community. And I'm going to begin by reviewing something that, that occurred to me a couple of decades ago. The division of cognitive labor is not the same as division of epistemic labor. And these labels are a bit arbitrary. The division of epistemic labor means having different people within a community, as it were, finding out and pronouncing on different areas. The division of cognitive labor takes a particular community with a particular expertise and asks what kinds of divisions of strategies for research and inquiry in that community there should be. So a division of cognitive labor is something that goes on within a particular expert community. Division of epistemic labor is what divides up the total community of inquirers into expert communities. So to use an example which much moved me, consider the search for the structure of DNA. Now, that search was undertaken in London by Rosalind Franklin, and who was under the nominal tutelage of Maurice Wilkins, who actually was the third person to win the Nobel Prize, because Franklin was dead by then. And of course, the people who got there first were James Watson and Francis Crick. And they did it not by doing what Franklin was doing, which was taking X-ray crystallographic pictures of bits of DNA and slowly trying to narrow in on what the structure of the molecule was. They did it by emulating techniques that had worked in other areas of trying to reconstruct molecules, namely by model building. A sort of sort of fly by the seat of your pants approach and guess a lot. And it wasn't helped by the fact that Watson was not always good at the biochemical details and sometimes needed correction by other people. Now, on the face of it, Watson-Crick's strategy was very unlikely to succeed, far less likely than Franklin's rather patient, but perhaps a bit more laborious approach to this problem. But it was good, the collectivity, that they were doing something different, that they didn't, as it were, replicate one another's inquiries. Now, there's a kind of logic which I'm going to walk you through very quickly. Since this is a philosophy department, and since philosophers actually do like symbols, I thought we could have a few symbols, and this would be the place to put them in. So here's the way to think about it. Suppose we form a community of inquirers, and there are n of us, right? And there are various strategies that we might adopt to do that. Then there's a function that is the probability of succeeding by using a particular strategy, call it S, if n of us, that is all of us, pursue it. Okay? Now, the probability of success, if we divide ourselves up, n1 of us to the first strategy, n2 to the second, nr to the rth strategy, assuming that no two strategies succeed, or can succeed, which is a very big assumption, but it's a nice simplifying assumption. Let's assume that if one strategy succeeds, none of the other strategies will succeed. It can be written simply as a sum. And what we want to do as a collectivity is maximize that probability. Now, suppose that the first strategy is much more promising than all the others, right? So for any other strategies and any combinations of them, I haven't said this in the slide, but I should have. If you put some people on the first strategy and some people on some mixture of the other strategies, that will always be worse than putting all the people on the first strategy. Then the appropriate thing is to put all your eggs in one basket and to have everybody pursue the most promising strategy. But suppose that that isn't the case, that there are diminishing returns. So if there are all but two of us pursuing this strategy, then the additional sort of raise in probability of assigning Samantha, who is one of the undecided ones, to that strategy is actually less than taking another strategy and assigning her to that. Then it's best to divide the labor. Okay, so you have division of cognitive labor. Okay, now, how do you get that? Well, a clue from Ernst Mayr, great evolutionary biologist, who used to argue ferociously with philosophers all the time. And once after a very long conversation, a parking lot outside the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology, Ernst, just as he was getting into his car, said, "You philosophers just don't understand. Scientists don't want the truth. They want to be right." Okay, anybody who's ever encountered Ernst knows the sort of ferocity with which he would have said that. Okay, so this puzzled me for a long time. Isn't the truth being right? Aren't these the same? No, that's not what Ernst meant. It's not just that a scientist wants to find out the truth. Wants to be the person who found out the truth. And probably in many cases wants not only to be the person who found out the truth, but also the person who found out the truth and was recognized as the person who found out the truth. Okay, so that's what I think is behind this. So that means that you actually, there's some pressure, if you have this attitude, to want to make the discovery first. Well, think of it this way. Suppose there are various methods available in your community for inquiring into a problem, and lots of people are choosing one which looks very promising, and there's this other one over here. Now, you can think about the situation this way. If you buy into the popular method, you're effectively buying a ticket in a lottery, right? And the chances of your winning are inversely proportional to the number of other people who buy tickets in that lottery, right? So if there are n people in the lottery, then you have to divide the probability of success, namely, the method succeeds and gives the right answer, by the number of people pursuing the method. Now, let's take the lone Samantha, all right? everybody else in the room is pursuing this method M. And Samantha comes along and she looks at the probability of winning by pursuing method M, and it's much greater for any number of scientists than this other method M star. But if she joins on, then there will be one more person pursuing that method. And so she will have to divide the probability of that method succeeding by the number of pursuing it. Whereas if she just goes off and does something completely different, her chances of winning the race may be higher, even though that is a less promising method. So even though the probability of M star given 1 is less than the probability of M given N, that is, method M succeeds given N people work on it, it may be that if you divide them by the numbers of people pursuing the methods, which is the appropriate figure for the competition in which Samantha is engaged, that the inequality on the right holds. Okay. I hope that's reasonably clear. All right, now what exactly does this show? It shows that you can achieve the valuable division of labor in a number of different ways. One way to do it would be to have very public-spirited scientists. So Samantha is a very public-spirited scientist, and when she enters a field of people inquiring, she looks around the field, she looks at the distribution of people pursuing various methods, and she says, how can I best be of use to the collective good? And she chooses that method which will maximize the overall chances that the collectivity solves the problem. Or it could be norms of pursuing what is good for the collective effort. She's not particularly idealistic or altruistic in these ways, but she is actually extremely subject to the norms of the community, and the norms of the community rigidly enforced by Jane tell her that she must do something other than pursue the most popular method. Those are ways in which you can get heterogeneity, but what my little excursion in probability shows is that you can get the search for credit is a kind of market mechanism and work in the scientific community to give you heterogeneity. Okay, so far so good. So it's valuable. It can be a valuable thing. The fact that scientists don't always get motivated by a disinterested search for the truth isn't necessarily a terrible thing, right? If they want to be right, in Meyer's sense, that can actually lead to pretty good results. The trouble is that if you have all these scientists competing with one another, what should be the appropriate model of consensus and diversity? Well, Kuhn and Feyerabend, when I was educated in philosophy and science, the two great bogeymen, they had to be resisted. They were evil relativists, were destroying rationality and progress. But in fact, on this score, Kuhn and Feyerabend offered radically different answers. Kuhn perhaps thought in terms of diversity of opinion on the way to getting things right. But the whole point of normal science is that once the decisions have been made, once the evidence is in, or perhaps even when decisions have to be made, the community coalesces. It settles on a paradigm. And then it can advance. It can do those great things that normal science does. It can build. It's not stuck in that ghastly pre-paradigm phase where philosophers floating around trying this idea and trying that idea. Feyerabend, on the other hand, wanted, dissent in permanence, clash of ideas. Now, the disadvantage of Kuhn's views, as Feyerabend pointed out in the late 1960s and 1970s, was that they made science into a tremendously dogmatic institution, a point that Kuhn had already conceded before he wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, when he wrote an article on the function of dogma in scientific research. Now, the problem with Feyerabend's approach, on the other hand, seems to be that nothing will ever get done. There will be no basis for policy whatever. They have all these flowers blooming, but nobody will ever pick them. Nothing will ever be translated into consensus, and it may be great to play, but science will no longer fulfill its role as a an important part of public knowledge that can direct public policy. Now, on the face of it, you can imagine a whole continuum of positions between Kuhn on one hand. Kuhn is on your left, this is unfortunate, and Feyerabend is on your right, which I don't think would please. But between the two, there's a lot of space. And one thing you might say is that based on perhaps all sorts of contingent issue-relative considerations, you might want a small amount of dissent even when the issue is resolved. And I think that's actually the way a lot of scientific communities function. They tolerate people whom I shall call, to use a much abused word, mavericks, and they tolerate these people. And people are induced to be mavericks for somewhat similar reasons to those that figure in the division of cognitive labor. Think of yourself as an aspiring scientist, right? You can perhaps win a Nobel Prize by doing normal science, by playing by the accepted rules. But if you want to be one of the really, really big figures, the ones who sort of go into the glorious celebratory histories of science written for people who are outside science, then you're going to break with tradition. So breaking with tradition is one of those things that has a very, very, very small probability of succeeding, most likely to end up labeled a crank, and you probably will end up being a crank, right? But the payoff is huge if you win, right, in the credit economy of science. So, and I think scientific communities tolerate a small amount of continued dissent. And dissent seems valuable for a good million reasons. We want people around inside the scientific community keeping, as it were, nagging at what seems to be established consensus. All right, so far so good. But now this whole credit economy thing has some important downsides. One downside is a pressure in sharing information. That was evident actually in the struggle for the structure of DNA. Rosalind Franklin was not sharing her photographic information with Watson and Crick. So Watson had to pinch it by filching a look at a few photographs when she was away from the lab. So there's pressure, because of competition, there are pressures against information sharing, which is arguably a very good device for advancing scientific inquiry along. There's also pressures on cutting corners in research. If you think you actually know what the truth about a particular phenomenon, it might be something involving primates and linguistic skills, and you could do the experiment, but you think you know already how it turns out. Maybe you won't do it. Now, I'm not actually going to make that, as it were, a serious. I mean, I don't think I'm not going to say seriously that this is what happened in the Mark Hauser business, which has so occupied discussions of fraud recently. I think it's perfectly possible that Hauser is completely honest, but you can see how that sort of thing can happen. Somebody is in the thick of a competition or doing a certain kind of research project, and you think you know how it's going to work, so you don't do an experiment or don't make observations that you know people are going to expect you to have made before you publish it. You just say, yeah, we know on the basis. It's silly and fussy. We'll just go ahead and say we've done it. But what really is troublesome in the context of democratic discussion is that one of the downsides of competition is that people who don't succeed in competition within the scientific community may have the opportunity to go public. And they can then exploit the rhetoric of free and open discussion as essential to democracy to obfuscate issues which, within the scientific community, are relatively clear. We're coming back to that question I said about the responsibilities of scientists to abide by, as it were, the decisions that have been made behind the scenes and not go out into the public arena and say, oh, by the way, there are dissenting opinions, even within the scientific community. There is a thing that I'm going to call universal punditry, and there's a fair bit of it around. Leo isn't here, so I don't have to apologize to him. The example, again, is climate change, and both of the figures, and in these two pictures are physicists. One is Freeman Dyson, a very great physicist, who has written in the New York Review of Books his own dissenting views on anthropogenic climate change. The other is S. Fred Singer, who is one of the villains of Naomi Oreskes' book. He is one of those people who is centrally involved in various institutes that have given money to block the acceptance of a whole range of things, from holes in the ozone layer to acid rain, to tobacco, to secondhand smoke, and now to global warming. So universal punditry is a very, very easy way for dissent to become accepted in the public mind, right? So even if you don't have people actually within the local community coming out and saying and voicing their objections, you can also have this other phenomenon where people from, as it were, outside the community who have been labeled as very distinguished scientists express their views to the public. Now, in my opinion, both Dyson and Singer are abrogating certain responsibilities, and this is actually, I think, very important. Now, there is actually, there are people within the scientific community at the moment who seem to me to be doing something about this. This is a colleague of mine and somebody whom I admire very much. One of the people most involved in the Human Genome Project and in coming to terms with its ethical, legal, and social implications, Nancy Wexler, who knew for most of her adult life, in fact, I think all of her adult life, that she was at risk of Huntington's disease, and worked very, very hard with a community in Venezuela to isolate the gene responsible, the genetic condition responsible for this. Nancy Wexler is less well known for having founded the Hereditary Disease Foundation, which gives money for various kinds of research on genetic diseases under two very serious conditions, right? And one is that credit is to be shared and materials and results are to be shared. She's cultivated what I like to think of as a team-playing ethos. And we go back to that quote from Dewey I gave you beforehand, I mean, in a certain sense, Nancy Wexler is embodying that Deweyan spirit, that spirit that she is part of a division of labor and she has responsibilities to the public. So one way of getting heterogeneity and without competition is, of course, to attempt to cultivate that within the scientific community and to decrease the pressures of the scientific credit economy, to foster cooperation and sharing of credit among scientists. Now, I want to suggest a further remedy along the lines I was going yesterday. The further remedy is to extend my notion of well-ordered science yet further. You may think I'm saying the same thing again and again and again, and in a sense I am. What I'm saying is that there is a constant need at the moment in interface between science and society for the recreation of trust in various contexts. And so once again, it seems to me that one way to do this would be to lead representative groups of citizens, representatives of a broader range of perspectives behind the scenes, so that they can come out and testify to the broader public about what the state of scientific play is. That's a different way of just pitching the scientific disputants into a public arena. Now, I want to close by emphasizing a last aspect of the problem, which will lead me to a curious further extension of the ideal of well-ordered science. One problem of our current discussions is a phenomenon that I'm going to call repetitive dissent. And I speak here from deep personal experience, since over the years I have been in fora with creationists and intelligent designers again and again and again and again and again. And often, not always, but often, they say the same things that have been refuted publicly again and again. Duane Gish this gentleman here, is notorious for doing this. And one of his great lines is that evolution, or evolution, as he would call it, is incompatible with the second law of thermodynamics. And, you know, people from very eminent physicists all the way down to me told him again and again and again why that wasn't so. But he continued to move on to the next audience and repeat it. This is a bit like being accused of a crime and getting convicted in one court and then saying, well, I'll go to another court now and maybe I can get off in this one. So this is a very problematic phenomenon, I think, for our public discussions and for the dissemination of scientific knowledge to the public who needs it. So here is a website. This is a very, very recent thing on a website. Same old stuff, long after Gish stopped writing books. I'm not sure Gish is even still alive. These things continue to be put out there as sources of information. And they not only appear on discussions of evolution, but they also appear with respect to climate change. Now, as you probably know, before you know, the Copenhagen summit, there was this phenomenon of hacking into the emails of people in the East Anglia Climate Centre, so-called ClimateGate. Perhaps some of you have seen some of the onto some of the sites where if you Google ClimateGate, or even better, Google video, hide the decline, in quotes, hide the decline. It's a song. It's about Michael Mann. Michael Mann thinks he's so smart, he invented that hockey stick chart, you know, decline temperatures and then whoosh at the end of the 20th century, right? And it's a quote from an email, hide the decline. We can use Mike's trick to hide the decline, is the phrase that is used again and again and again in all of this. So notice the words that appear here, right? Essential ingredients, contemptible conspiracy, proxy reconstructions, as though these were really awful fabricated things. You know, decline Jones so urgently sought to hide, right? Okay, so you get the flavor. If I knew how to do PowerPoint better, I would have played you the video, because it's so slick. It's amazingly slick, this video of a Michael Mann cartoon figure singing this song about hiding the decline, right? Now, if you look at these sites, what you find are things like Christopher Brooker, whom I think writes for the Daily Telegraph in Britain, which used to be much better on public discussions of climate change. Right, so this is the worst scientific scandal of our generation. And of course you find things like this. This is Al Gore standing outside the snow-covered Capitol with the global warming conference has been cancelled. Now, I'll draw your attention to the graphs at the top. So, these are graphs that represent temperature fluctuations over the course of, I don't know, 2,000 years in one case and 600 years in another. And they're very reassuring for climate deniers, because, look, the temperature got very warm in the Middle Ages and then it got cold and now it's gotten warm again, but it hasn't got as warm as it got in the Middle Ages. And notice, we have uncovered the decline, right? Or uncovered a decline at the end. The other one, interestingly enough, the one on the right is from a different, it's a different climate denying source. Okay, now, if you go to realclimate.org, which is a terrific site, you can find your way to James Hansen's response to these allegations, a very measured and sober response. And he draws a different graph. This is, of course, this is the orthodox consensus graph. And it is done by elaborate, methodologically impeccable procedures for representing the data. The trouble is that there are so many ways of working your way through the whole mass of stuff that scientists potentially have available to them. And what you want is ways of taking from that data sample, those data samples in ways that give you the things that are most statistically significant. And Hansen, like Mann, like the late Steve Schneider, knows how to do that. Very hard, I think, to explain this to the general public. I think I'm not convinced I understand all the methodological niceties of it. I suspect there are a few people in this room who do understand that. I suspect Bob understands it, but it's actually very tricky to think of pitching this sort of thing into the general arena. Okay, so how do you come to terms with this sort of problem, which is very bottom level climate change stuff? Is anthropogenic global warming real? And the deniers say no, and their denials get in the way of the very serious and difficult debates that we should be having about what to do about it and what the effects are likely to be. It seems to me there's a last role for my little citizen juries, and this is the final extension of well-ordered science that I will give you. I think the role that they might play is actually to attest to the general public that in the latest episode of repetitive dissent, nothing new has been said. So we could let the dissenters air their dissent, but have an institution of a requirement. Any airing of dissent on this issue must be, after due evaluation by a citizen jury, must be accompanied by a disclaimer. This is the same old story refuted on previous occasions. I like that because it's more like the British Surgeon General's warning than the American one. Instead of saying, the Surgeon General determined that smoking may be injurious to your health, I like the directness of smoking kills, actually. So, to summarize everything I've said, I think that in the context of agenda setting, in the context of certification, and in the context of transmission of scientific knowledge to the public, there are serious problems. That these problems have led to a breakdown of trust, that certain differences are needed from within the scientific community. I've suggested a much more open agenda-setting process that would involve the values of a more representative class of the human population. And I've also suggested that there should be explanation and putting forward of the kinds of value judgments that play a role in scientific certification. And I've suggested a downplaying of the credit economy of science in favor of the cultivation of something like a team-playing ethos. But principally, what I've wanted to see is some conduit through which trust can be reestablished and transmission of public knowledge can lead from people who have it and who have, as it were, made it to the broad public that needs it. That's the central problem. And the only thing I come up with, and it's probably not the best thing, is to latch on to this idea of well-ordered science and really make it more complete and more wide-ranging, and to take the literature and the idea of these small juries, it's an imperfect approximation, I know, and see them as operating in the context of what seems to me a deep social epistemological problem. So I will leave things there, and that's the end of the story.
Thank you.